Hello, we're John and Elizabeth.
Hello.
We're sat at anchor in Carbis Bay where we were overnight, really waiting for the tide to turn in our favour, and mercifully the fog has cleared. This episode is very much about our trip down through Wales to the North Cornish coast. I hope you enjoy this episode. Thank you very much for watching.
Thank you.
It's not the first time Elizabeth and I have sailed on this coast. We did a delivery trip a few years ago, Portsmouth to Cardiff, which we did in 3 days, and that's the exact opposite of what we're encountering at the moment, which is really
leisurely pace.
Leisurely pace. That's true, but the leisurely pace is being forced by a lack of wind. But we anchored last night in Carbis Bay. I'll show you that in a second. It's been shrouded in fog until just a few minutes ago, but we'll wait for the tide and then get round the corner. Should be fine.
I think we're planning a bit later on this afternoon.
Yeah, we want to get the ebb tide round the corner, but not before there's too much ebb tide on the other side, if you see what I mean. So we want to hit slack water-ish on the other side by Runnelstone, which should be fine. One of the things about Scotland is that we were either at anchor or on a mooring buoy or on a very small jetty, and getting alongside and parking up was all pretty straightforward. We got really good at that. Here we've had to deal with locks, locking in and out. We've had to deal with parking on walls, and we've had to, for the first time in ages, raft up on other boats. So that's added to the repertoire of things.
But also, it's given me a lot of experience.
Sometimes you go around the corner into a harbour, you really don't know what you're going to be faced with. You could be scaling the wall, throwing the lines to somebody else. And what was lovely going into Caernarfon particularly was harbour master had put us on a much smaller boat, maybe a 24-foot boat, and I just looked at it and went, that doesn't look right. And the people on the next boat went, that doesn't look right, why don't you come and park on us? And they were really welcoming and really helpful. That was good. Yeah, so it's been an interesting trip, but I am loving the way that this fog has burnt off today, with the way that it didn't do yesterday. Yesterday was anything between a couple of 100 yards and a mile and a half. But I mean, we had the kite up when it was clear, but we were motoring for a fair bit of it. Yeah. A little bit difficult to remember, but Caernarfon was nearly a fortnight ago as we arrived. The tide was sweeping across the entrance. We had to steer nearly 30 degrees off the line until the very last moment, and then when we were through the gap there was a hard turn to get into our berth, rafted 3 deep. Halfway through, one of the boats went and we were there, but this shows our securing lines onto the jetty, including having to lead lines clear. The thing I've also done is I've taken to running with a block in the midships position. This is very useful when securing to another boat that has a midships cleat. We enjoyed Caernarfon very much, a really friendly place, especially the yacht club, and the castle is absolutely the stuff of fairy tales. But a couple of days it was time to go, so we exited. It's a terrific view as we go out, and we headed down the coast. It is, I think, fair to say that sometimes decisions just make themselves. We left Caernarfon and exited over the Caernarfon bar and went to Porthdin Cline and spent the night there at anchor. Slightly rolly, but pleasant enough. Left there first thing this morning, maybe an hour or so before sunrise, and we're now headed southwest into 8-9 knots of breeze, so we're going okay, but not brilliantly. We had originally thought that we might go to Aberystwyth or Fishguard, but in 24 hours time the wind is going to be fairly stiff from the northwest, which makes both of those places tricky. So I think we are going to basically head straight down towards Milford Haven and get in there as soon as we can, and then base ourselves in Milford Haven for a little while. That should be a sensible plan, I think. But I think Aberystwyth and Fishguard out of the question. Whether we go to Solva or somewhere in between Ramsey and Jack Sounds, I don't know. That might be something that we can do from Milford Haven. So we'll see how it goes. But it's a very lovely sunrise, nice and warm, few boats out, maybe with much the same plan as us. I think it all gets a bit everybody follows the same plan when the weather starts to dictate. It was reasonably light as we headed down, but we were making okay speed, and we were joined by dolphins. Not so many in the bay and not so playful as we'd seen earlier. As the day pressed on, we could see the change in the weather up ahead of us. It was as clear as a bell, and it started to stiffen up ever so gently, but actually that was good, because I was nervous that we weren't going to make the Jack or Ramsey Sound for the tide. But by the time we got to sunset, we had a fair old bit of breeze, and it was looking good for getting through that gap. But it was going to be night time, and I didn't want to go through either Jack Sound or Ramsey Sound in the dark. We weren't going to have a moon, and it was quite cloudy in any case. But we pressed on, and quite a bit of reading of the pilot book, and we decided to go outside of Jack Sound and then through Broad Sound, and I'll show you that in just a second. So as we head down towards St David's and St Anne's Head, Jack Sound just there, and then Ramsey Sound beneath it. We came round the outside of Ramsey Island, and then south, and then round the outside of the next island and through Broad Sound here. It got a little bit lumpy, but it was okay. And then we got through the washing machine and into Dale Anchorage. I think we anchored up about 3 or 4 o'clock in the morning, put the anchor down in Dale Anchorage, and then following morning made our way into Milford Haven Marina, which we did when it was on free flow. So we went straight through the lock gates, big turn round, and straight down to the very far end of the marina, and a nice little berth quite near the facilities, parked up there for a couple of days. Very pleasant it was. Getting into Milford Haven was all very straightforward, because the lock gates at the entrance were on free flow, which they do a couple of hours either side of high water. But high water had moved on, and we wanted to get up the river, so we decided that we were going to depart, got ourselves all sorted out, and then we've got this bit of a technique at the moment of easing ourselves back quite a long way. Because the prop walk is so pronounced, what we try and do is get the boat at least 40-50% of the way out of the berth before doing anything, and that just involves me using a tiny little bit of a stern, but Elizabeth just pulling in gently on the forespring in order to ease the boat backwards. And to be honest, it wouldn't work in a huge breeze, but it seems to work reasonably nicely here. So I just ease a slipping line at the stern. Elizabeth gently pulls in on the forespring, and we get out. Sometimes we do this by putting a line on midships, and I can pull it in on the winch if we need a bit more support there. But then I can get rid of the rope itself. By this stage, Elizabeth's just got the forespring on, and that is rigged on a slip as well. By this stage, we're hanging most of the way out of the berth, tiny bit of a stern, and you can see we're canted bow in. As I come astern, the boat comes off fairly squarely, and then once a tiny little bit of way on, they're gently into neutral, and then the rudder starts to act again. And this was really easy to do, because it was quite nice and light.
but we were going to go from this berth up to the fuel berth and then to lock out. So we were started off port side, then we're going to be starboard side, then we're going to be port side alongside again. So fairly busy little morning. Once we had fueled, we got ourselves ready. The lock in Milford, like Cardiff and Caernarfon, I think, and maybe even Swansea, I can't remember, they have inside the lock, because they're nice and wide, much wider than Crinan, they have floating pontoons inside the lock that you secure to and then float up and down on those. So we had fueled up, and we've been motoring a bit more on this part of the journey than we have done before. So, but we've got an extremely small tank, maybe 20 litres. So we tend to top up whenever we can. Very often, just putting 5 litres into a jerry can. But in this particular case, we topped up. I don't think it was much more than about 5 or 6 litres, which maybe feels a bit of a wasted journey, but perhaps not. But we started to exit Milford Haven, and as we came round and lined up in the dock, you can see the far end of the dock is closed off there. And then what we're going to do is just motor in onto one of these floating pontoons, and I think they're probably designed for boats a bit bigger than ours. As we were approaching, Elizabeth was saying to me, I'm not sure I'm going to be able to jump up that high, and I've got some sympathy with that point of view, because when I did it when we were alongside and stopped, it was still quite hard work. Fortunately, there was a little boat alongside, and because I was worried about going forward into them, we decided to put the stern line on first. So Elizabeth took that, and as we approached, he was there, and we passed the line to him. It is very organised, the locking in and locking out here. We had to book, ideally a few hours in advance. They put the right number of boats in. They allocate you port or starboard side, so you know in advance which side you're going to be, and then they call you in order. It all happens on the half hour, and it worked really very well indeed. Because the pontoons are floating, they just drop down nice and gently, and when everything's equal, water level on either side, the gate opens, and it is just a fairly straightforward sort of departure. So we were in with small fishing boats, leisure fishermen, so they all shot off at a great rate of knots, and we just gently exited into the river, and instead of turning right in order to head out, we turned left in order to make our way up and under the bridge and up into the upper reaches of Milford Haven, where we were then able to find an anchorage. It is very lovely up the far end of the river. We anchored in Castle Reach and spent a little bit of time there, probably just on the edge of the back eddy, so we swung around a bit, but it was pleasant enough. Anchored here in about 8 metres of water, and because we were leaving the boat, we then went to a small boatyard a bit further up, spent the night there, and then we left the boat for a week. Arriving back via taxis to restart our journey. I suspect that sailors are a bit like farmers in that weather's the right weather. So we arrived back in Milford Haven, knowing that we needed to get south, but the high pressure had come in, and therefore crossing the Bristol Channel down to Padstow down here was going to take a bit of a time. I'd originally planned to go to Lundy, but that wasn't to be. In the end, it was a very slow passage with a fair bit of motoring, but we arrived shortly after sunrise. Very spectacular sunrise. Thought I might have had to anchor, but actually by the time we got to Padstow itself, it was just about high water, so we went pretty much straight in. Had a look at the entrance once we were in, and you can see just exactly how much it does indeed dry. Padstow itself is a very, very pretty harbour, surrounded by bars and restaurants and ice cream shops, and there's no shortage of people eating pasties, and we were parked on the wall rather than on the pontoon, so we had to adjust our lines occasionally as the gates opened and shut. but it was a very pleasant place to stay. We ate some fantastic seafood, so good Elizabeth bought the book. And when we weren't milling around ashore, it was very pleasant just to watch the comings and goings in the harbour. Every time the gate opened, a couple of people would go out, a couple of people would come in. Most people were either down from Milford Haven and heading back that way, so in conversation a lot of people were expecting to do a fair bit of motoring, which is just a little bit dull, but there we go. It was nice sitting on the dockside, just watching the world go by. It was particularly lovely to wander along the beach and see the infamous Doom Bar, and we managed to spend a very pleasant afternoon strolling around the immediate vicinity of Padstow. Very lovely indeed.
Well, we got back and we feel as if we've embarked on the last leg of our journey. We've got a month to go or so before we arrive back in Portsmouth.
Yeah, it's tinged with a bit of sadness.
It is, yeah. But we have been running a little bit of a top of the pops for things.
A league table.
A league table. So facilities, friendliness, fish and chips, food and drink, and photographability, which is my way of getting 5 Fs in ish. If we'll do a special episode on this at the end, but if there's another category you'd like to know about, do let us know. Thank you very much for watching.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you. Bye.